Hello again, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski, managing editor at the Cipher Brief. We have a conversation today that will take us inside Russian classrooms. We're doing that this week because this week Russia unveiled a new textbook for high schools in Russia. It's called The Military History of Russia. And among other things, it goes out of its way to justify the 2022 invasion of Ukraine as having been a defensive necessity. The textbook says Russia was, quote, forced to invade Ukraine, and it equates the invasion to the Soviet Union's fight against Nazi Germany. This will now be required reading for Russians about age 15 and older. We're joined today by Stanislav Kucher, who is the editor-in-chief of Samizdat Online. He's a former Russian TV journalist who now lives and works in the United States. He knows a lot about how the Kremlin works to influence opinion in Russia and around the world. And Stan, thank you so much for being with us. You've spoken to us and written for us at the Cipher Brief before. I want to start with just a basic question. To what extent, and I know it's hard to make a blanket statement about these kinds of things, but to what extent do you think the Russian public, young or old, buys into this narrative that the war was necessary? It's just like World War II, fighting Nazis and so forth.
Thank you, Tom. I would say that around 60% of young Russians do buy into this narrative to a different extent. Like there are many young Russians who believe that America has always been an adversary, if not an enemy, of the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, and currently Putin's Russia. When I say 60%, I refer to the results of a recent public poll by Levada, which is a more or less independent polling agency. But then again, you can't trust all public polls in Russia today, especially when they ask questions about the policy of the government of the Kremlin. But when it comes to describing the general mood of the Russian people, the general attitude to America, for example, or to Russian history, then yes, those results you can trust. And that's why I can safely say that yes, around 60% of younger Russians believe that.
So given that, and given that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, therefore, are succeeding to some extent in getting that message across, why do you think the Kremlin or the ministries of education or whoever is behind this felt it necessary to put out a kind of, we're only 3 years into this war, to put something in the classrooms that makes this case to kind of, tell kids in Russia, this is the way it is and was?
Well, this did not happen yesterday, Tom. And this new textbook is, I would just say, it's a new chapter in a textbook in a history textbook that the Kremlin has been writing for the past at least 10 years, and especially actively since February 24th, 2022, since the start of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. For example, back in 2022, they introduced the so-called lessons about the important, lessons about what is important in Russian schools, in Russian elementary schools, when they would bring veterans of the so-called special military operation to schools to lecture about what's going on in Ukraine, what's important and what's not. So this is already a part of the school program. And this new textbook, it just explains what has already been said in the course of the past 3 years. Now it's official, let's put it this way. And now it's everywhere. But in fact, as I said, teachers were obliged to lecture on pretty much the same things which are now described in this textbook throughout the past 3 years and even before that.
Yeah, so it's codified in a way. Um, Now, the editor of this, it's a three-volume history, is Vladimir Medinsky, described as an aide to Vladimir Putin. I gather you know a little about him or know him. What can you tell us about the guy behind this effort?
Well, Vladimir Medinsky is a typical governmental official, a typical uh, place hunter, career climber, whatever you call him, the guy who always wanted to make it to the top. And he was Minister of Culture. I'm not sure if you guys know, but there is such a
Mhm.
thing as Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation. So he was Minister of Culture, and he was pretty much in charge of influencing the educational system in Russia. He also wrote a number of books. For example, he wrote three books called Myths About Russia. But
Myth.
what's interesting is that he has not always been like this. I remember him in the 90s when he was all for democracy, all for reforms. Even in the early zeros, in the first decade of the new millennium, he was a pretty pro-Western politician. He was elected to the Russian State Duma, and he advocated political reform. He advocated Western values. He spoke against political extremism, against nationalism, against xenophobia. And then he joined the lines of what Mr. Ramzan Kadyrov calls Putin's field soldiers.
Right.
So he is there now. And I've known him since I was 17 and he was 19 because we went to college together
Mm.
and we attended the class called Propaganda and Information Work, where one of our professors, and I also remember that his last name, used to tell us that, it's you guys who will make the new information reality in
Wow.
Russia and in the world. It's you who will be in charge of creating this new virtual reality. And I'm pretty positive that Vladimir Medinsky, Volodya Medinsky, because he's Volodya to me, just like
Mhm.
I'm Stas for him. So he is now very, very extremely proud, realizing that, yes, he is now filling the minds of young Russians.
It's interesting. I mean, I have to think about your professor all those years ago. He had two students in his information propaganda course. One of them is now, writing textbooks, and you are now in the United States doing samizdat online. Anyhow, let me ask you a question which may sound a little bit naive, Stan, about young people in Russia generally. Um, we are, I think people think these days that even in a state that has control over the information flow, that people, young people especially, but people generally who are curious, have a way to at least have access to some other sources of information. They might have VPNs. They might have, even in China. I mean, North Korea seems the only place where there's just no hope for any of that. Is that a naive thing? Are young people in Russia not able to access other information, or are they really buying into this, this line no matter what?
Both, Tom. I mean, they do have access to all, modes of information. They have access to the internet. They use VPNs. They access the internet without VPNs, and yet, yes, they are buying into all of this. Again, they're not buying into. They know that Putin invaded Ukraine. They know about fight for power. They know everything about Putin and his coterie, exploiting millions of Russians and stealing from them. They know about corruption. They know about everything. But this precise line about the West wishing to economically or and politically or militarily conquer Russia. Yes, they believe that somehow. And
Mhm.
they do believe that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a preemptive attack designed to protect Russia. And that if Russia had not attacked them, probably Ukraine would have.
Mm.
So yes, unfortunately, a lot of Russians are buying that.
Recognizing excellence in national security. The Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
There was early on in the war, there was a lot of discussion that, well, first of all, I think Putin and a lot of others had suggested, or the assumption was the war would be short. And another assumption was if it dragged on, it might be very bad for the Kremlin. Certainly people here and in Europe, and I think, dare I say, in Russia too, assumed that if there were going to be a huge number of casualties, it would be super damaging, right? And so here we are, almost at the 3-year mark. Depending on what count you take, but even conservative numbers, it's hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded Russians. And it does not seem from a distance, and to quote the same, somewhat reliable polls that you have, 60, 70% support the war, and even higher number, I think, support Vladimir Putin. How do you account for that? And is there sort of nothing that might happen in the war that would change that?
Again, Tom, the thing is, it's not 70% who support the war. Mm-hmm. It's 70% who believe that the war was an inevitable, an imminent step to prevent an existential threat to Russia. Mm-hmm. That the West posed, the West in general, the so-called collective West, and Ukraine at their service. Mm-hmm. That's what Russians believe. But just a couple of days ago, I spoke with a renowned army general, a former aide to Vladimir Putin, Leonid Ivashov, who described to me the mood or the attitude of many Russians. And they, like his head of a huge alliance of former servicemen, of former military, and they have their own polling agency in Russia. They conduct their own research. They had done a lot of research before the war, and they had warned Putin against the war. They had called on him not to invade. They predicted casualties. They predicted Russia's isolation. They predict pretty much everything that has happened ever since in the past 3 years. And so he told me that not a single of his acquaintances, not a single Russian military veteran, including those who fought in Ukraine now, are for the continuation of this war. They all understand that this war is evil. They all understand that Russia doesn't need this war anymore. And yet, yes, this may seem paradoxical, but yet at the same time, Russians just don't know what to do next. They think that they have gone too far now. And now that they've gone this far, the only way for them is to keep supporting Vladimir Putin, because if they don't, then the West, together with Ukraine, will crush Russia, just like the world crushed Nazi Germany in World War II. And Russians don't want that. So we are really in a very troublesome, dangerous situation. I wouldn't call it hopeless, but yeah, it's a dangerous situation. Russians listen to Trump, and they do want this war to end. They are really, really afraid that the end of this war will mean the destruction of the Russian state, the elimination of the Russian sovereignty, and the end of Russian independence, which is not true, of course. But again, I'm pretty positive it will take years, if not decades, it will probably take a change in generations, just like it happened in Germany In the case with Nazi Germany, it took more than 20 years before Germans realized that they actually were wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a pretty similar situation with Russia at this point.
Yeah. It's really interesting and depressing, but really interesting. Stan Kuchar, thank you so much for joining us at the Cipher Brief. Stanislav Kuchar is, again, editor-in-chief of Samizdat.online, and always great to talk to you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom. Always here.